Latinx, a person of Latin American origin or descent, used as a gender-neutral or non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina.
Latinx, we're black, we're brown, we're white. We're immigrants, we break binaries and cross borders. We speak all languages and are of all abilities, faiths, spiritualities, sizes, gender identities, sexual orientations, and documentation statuses, and we're here to stay.
I'm Alejandra.
I'm Ana.
This is Latinx Mental Health Podcast, where we talk to therapists, researchers, artists, activists, and students about their experiences in the intersections of mental health and Latinx identity. In each interview, we aim to connect through our voices, our struggles, and our triumphs, as we sample a different herbal tea, just like Abuela used to make.
For this episode, we spoke to Gabriela Poli Dueñez, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, whose new book, Unwanted Witnesses, Journalists and Conflict in Contemporary Latin America, is now available. We drank jasmine green tea and talked about journalists' experiences in Latin America and the representation of violence in contexts of armed conflict.
This episode contains discussion of political violence and extortion against journalists, so keep that in mind while listening and take good care. The Latinx Mental Health Podcast is not a substitute for professional mental health care. We encourage you to seek resources and support in your community.
So could you tell us a little bit about who you are, about your background, about the work that you do?
So I'm Gabriela Poli. I'm from Ecuador originally. I came to the U.S. to study for 2 years, and this is going to be my 27th.
Slight extension.
Yeah, it's long, 2 years. I am a professor at UT. I teach Spanish and Portuguese, Latin American literature, and I have worked with the representation of violence. I did some research on the representation of narco-trafficking. I work in Culiacan and Medellin, and that led me to meet many journalists covering narco-trafficking, basically, and violence. And that opened these questions, that all the things that I said were, wow, these are the guys dealing with the real issues in writing, and that's the hinge that I talk about. How do they experience, witness, and put into words? That is something that I really wanted to explore. So my research now, and I'm completing a book on this, is about how emotions are involved in this representation of violence, because we learn, whatever we learn from journalists. We are facing texts that are charged with that violence, and that's exactly what I wanted to look at.
And for the sake of the listener who may not know much about reporting in Latin America, can you talk about the physical threat?
Okay, so Latin America, I would say that Latin America, first of all, it's a region in which violence has escalated in general in the last 20 years. It's the deadliest region in deaths per capita. Mm-hmm. Across the board. I mean, we are not talking about dictatorships. Now we have Venezuela. But in general, I'm just talking as a whole. In the last 20 years, Latin American violence has increased in general. It's the deadliest democratic region, which is something that it's shocking. Now, you zoom in, and it has become also the deadliest region for journalism. And it has specific places where this is. Mexico is the deadliest country in the world for a journalist. And I think that this varies from year to year. I'm pretty sure that the numbers went even higher than the countries at war in the Middle East. But if, let's say that Afghanistan is worse, Mexico will be up there. Mm-hmm. Colombia is the second one. Brazil is the third one. There are many more dead, but they are not included because they don't know the reasons. So they just put in their list the ones that are proved to be assassinated because they are journalists.
Right.
Now, there are many, many more, but there are still, since the worst part of this is that assassinations against journalists remain unprosecuted. And that is the thing. I mean, it is not just the gross numbers of how many have died, have been killed. It is the numbers of prosecutions of those assassinations. And the relation is like 1%.
Can you talk more about why that is? What factors or forces are causing that?
Well, that question has to do with the way that our democracies are working. You know, you have a democratic, you can have, we have here a president that is saying that fake news is fake news. That's one thing. But if a journalist is killed and the government is not solving that crime, there's some sort of collusion there because you're not interested in prosecuting and punishing the people behind that crime. So the journalists the numbers of the journalists killed, again, by ICJ, this institution that only published the number of killings that are proved to be because they were journalists. They all cover things that were not good for the powerful. And I'm not meaning just state. I'm meaning private interests. And you can say a mine company, and the journalist was talking about how the community was coping with that. You can talk about narco-trafficking, obviously. I mean, Javier Valdez is the most obvious for me. He published something that, and this is word to mouth. Everybody knows that who killed or who sent him to kill were Chapo Guzman's sons because they weren't happy with what he published. So there you go. But there's no legal process to prove and punish the culprits. So it is not just the violence against the press, which is whenever the press gets to me that I'm the powerful, either as a state authority, as a narco trafficker, or as a big corporation interest, out. But the perverse part of this is that those crimes are not solved. So where is our democracy? Where is our system of law?
Yeah, impunity.
Exactly. So at the same time, I think that from my experience, mother's experience, one of the most traumatic things for journalists, sometimes it's not just the horrible things they see, the violence, massacres. Those things are horrible and they are very traumatic. But the trauma of interviewing the authorities and knowing that they are turning their back to that, I think that psychological and moral trauma goes way deeper. Because that lack of absolute faith in the system, it's appalling. Psychologically, it's appalling.
And my understanding of like diagnosable PTSD is that one of the factors is whether or not you feel you had any agency.
Exactly.
And yeah, if a person feels completely helpless in a situation, that the chances of getting a diagnosable trauma goes up. That is related to, in the case of journalists, that is the trauma of fear. That is the trauma of having to be silent. Because there are many ways, there are many times, and this is something that many journalists have said to me. You know that there are things that you cannot say
You just know there are names that you cannot mention. You can say that crime was committed by the Chapo Guzman group, or the Sinaloan cartel, or the Cartel de Juarez, or the Zetas. But you can never mention a name, because then the retaliation is, so that is one part of it. What you're saying is, this is what we have to understand when the press people say fear is making us remain silent. That seems kind of obvious thing. Yes, if you're threatened, you just remain silent. What that carries is a profound sense of trauma, because what you're keeping, your silence is keeping, is impunity. And that is a lack of agency, as you put it. And I will call it like the moral burden of knowing that there's no way out. Because the horrible thing happened. And you come and you say, this horrible thing happened, and the authority just turned away. That is the most traumatic thing. There's no way out. Right. The system is, and I've seen journalists going through severe health problems, severe psychological problems, dealing with alcohol as a way of coping. I mean, whatever the symptoms, and on this side you are more knowledgeable than I am of how people deal with PTSD. But that's something that it's happening because journalists are witnessing that betrayal to what our democratic system is supposed to stand for.
And it's daily.
Right. Well, and the other part of PTSD that seems really relevant in this case is that it's something that's trauma tends to be something that's unexpected, or that you can't know when it's coming. And so you can live in a situation where you know violence exists, but not necessarily know when it might or might not affect you personally. And so that level of uncertainty that you're talking about, that fear piece around when will it strike, and that is something that you hold, and that daily holding of not knowing, I think, is also very, over time, we would call that toxic stress, or we would call it, right, something that can work away at you every day.
Yeah. I mean, and this opens up another part, which is how do they live with threats, or how do the threats occur? And we usually have the idea that a threat is a call saying, hey, we're watching you, like in the movies. And threats are a lot more elusive. It could be a rumor, Right. Your brother, your father was sitting with these guys at the cafe, and they say, your brother should take care of himself because he's not doing that. I've heard that it's better. So it's your level of paranoia in that sense. It's never overstated, because threats do not come as in the movies. Threats are just a rumor, and you know that rumor began somewhere, and you should be careful. So that level of, I think that a threat, a phone call, it's more obvious, and know it for a fact. But those rumors make you live constantly in a state of paranoia,
right?
Because you don't know if they have a true origin or not, but they exist, and many threats go out like that.
Yeah, and physiologically, what that does, what that does to your nervous system to be on high alert all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what do you want people to know about understanding some of the broader implications of the experiences of the journalists that you've interviewed?
Society thinks of the work of journalists as something happening in the other room. It's not something that exactly what your program is trying to do. People don't think about as something that affects us all.
Yeah.
So, well, my book it's an academic book, but it's at least I want to make their voices heard. And I think that journalists, because they are the ones who listen and they are the ones who spread news, information, they remain in this shadow, or because we don't see them. We don't know what's going on in their lives. We don't know what it takes.
Right.
Yeah.
And another thing that I've noticed a lot is that most of the journalists I work with, or I've heard, it's not that they chose to write on violence or these events. They were reporters of, let's say, poverty, health, education in poor neighborhoods. And one day they went back and they realized that they were war reporters. And they were not trained to be in that situation.
Right.
This has been changing throughout these last 10 years, but that's the way it all began. It's not that they chose and said, oh, I'm going to cover. No. You know?
Yeah.
And the training and the protection and their dialogues come mainly because they are organizing themselves. It's not that the media as an institution, let's say the newspapers or the radio stations or the TV, are doing something for the people who work for them. No, they have to get organized on the side, because the media for which they work are not doing anything. So they are alone. They are lonely in the job they do.
But I think it's similar with mental health professionals. We're the ones who are holding that space for people, and so that's also part of this program is looking at like who are the people who are holding the space.
Right, and especially like not that it happens perfectly in every program, but mental health professionals in theory have some training on how to hold space.
Yeah.
And that impacts. I'm just thinking about, okay, without that training, and you're a journalist and you have deadlines and all the other things, because you're also, I imagine that also the product is different. So in mental health, you're holding the space, right? But you're also able to sort of set it aside to a point in some ways. But as a journalist, you're having to internalize it to the point that you can then talk about it or write about it, right? That's a deeper level of understanding or of processing, maybe.
It is a different level, I think. And there are two aspects to this, which is, I mean, if you take a U.S. war reporter going to Syria, let's say, the person will have a training not just to digest what he's going to or she's going to experience, but also to go out in these territories. They need to be trained on how to walk on a war territory. So to begin with, most of the journalists began doing their jobs without that basic training, which is not the mental yet. It's just the basic, find your way and be safe, right?
Where do you go? Where do you not go?
Where do you go? How do you go? I mean, there are certain basic things, right? Instinct, we all have. And as the Latin American women have that instinct very, very developed. You don't go out at night by yourself. I mean, several things. But we're talking about profession, right? And then the other part, which is they were not trained. They didn't have the train to be the ones holding this bag. And at the same time, they have the job to translate. And in that sense, they are like a hinge because they need to be super respectful on what the victim is going through. And at the same time, be able to deliver what this victim is going through to a broad audience. So that position is very stressful because there are ways in which you can stigmatize the victim, you can stereotype the victim,
Right.
you can step over the dignity of that victim because you want to have a great story.
Right.
So walking that fine line, I have learned a lot from these journalists, saying it was difficult for me to put these in words. I have these journalists who said, well, I went there after a big explosion and people were talking nonsense. And they were talking nonsense because they were under shock.
Right.
I mean, it's something that I published already, and it's a story of a guerrilla. The ELN in Colombia set a bomb on a oil pump, and the gas went, and this town was nearby, so they didn't realize somebody turned on a match or whatever, and the whole town exploded, and 80 people died, burned, and but nothing happened. The bomb was like far away, but the wind brought all the gas to the town. So the people were explaining these as gods sending this horrible thing, and this is back in the 90s. But the journalist said, I couldn't write about this. I was too young, I didn't have the means. And then she spent a couple of nights in the town, but she also saw how, and it was very difficult to get to the town. She took a bus, she took a plane, she took the bus and then a motorcycle to get into this town, very into the jungle. But then she saw some other journalists from the big chains coming in helicopter, landing, staying a couple of hours, eating whatever was there in the grocery store, leaving it empty, and taking off with the story. So she witnessed everything, and she went back and she never wrote a word about this because she said, I couldn't. I wasn't prepared. I didn't have. I was very young, but she still remembers this as something very strong in her career.
And I think that brings up another challenge, which is at what point is violence spectacle? At what point does it becomes a show?
Exactly.
And I think it's hard for smaller independent journalists to do those stories because they're competing with the spectacle that is
Exactly.
violence.
Exactly. That was, I mean, she was on her own, she was freelancing. And how do you compete a story with those images? I mean, whoever guys or girls were with big cameras and showing the things. That's something that gives a straight truth to the events that you're writing. So my analysis there, I mean, this is a very good story to show the journalist who wants to really give account of what the victims go through, what they are exposed to. Sometimes, at that point in her career, that silence was a silence of respect. Because she knew the limits and she didn't want to write what people were saying, because then the portrait of these people would have been like, but she understood the kind of shock they were going through, that first minute of, so I talked to her about this, and we spent a long time talking about why she couldn't write about this. And she couldn't write about this, and it kind of silenced her for a long time because she realized that she needed to approach the victims in a different way, to really give account of what they were saying. How is it that the victim's language could be put into my own words to say something to the community? So the work she did after that was help the victims write their own testimonies. And she didn't write on her own about victims. She edited 3 different books. In Colombia has a long, long history of war and armed conflict. So she kind of chose special groups, the groups in social classes, the ones that she first worked with the ones displaced. So they are mostly people living in shanty towns in the big cities. Then she worked with middle class people who have lost loved ones to the war. And then she worked with people in the countryside who went on this se me fue la palabra en español. Minas, como campo minado.
Like mining camps.
Yeah. When you walk and you don't know that there are bombs and they just explode, so they have lost limbs.
Minefields.
Minefields, exactly. Yeah. Minefield. The word just left. So
new
they walk in
vocabulary.
minefields and have lost limbs, or so she targeted these groups, and she did an amazing job. But it took her all this work to come up with her own story about war.
Wow.
To build up again the sense of my voice also has something to say. You know, I would say it kind of have her own security in her own job. She lost it. And I don't think that she lost it because she witnessed the horror of the violence only. I think that she lost it because she saw how her peers work with that. And it kind of put her on the corner and said, I don't want to be part of that.
Yeah. And the news cycle is so quick. And I worked with asylum seekers, and a lot of my job was to sort of be the go-between between the press and them. And sometimes it was just appalling, the questions that would be asked, like without any sensitivity to what the person had just been through. You know, questions like, "How did you feel when your mother was killed in front of you?" Like, without any respect. And so, you know, that is a reality of some of the journalism we're seeing right now, and I think there's been pushback towards that.
Yeah.
But it's getting sort of misconstrued in this like fake news, like you can't trust the press. I don't know if you could help us, like maybe suss that out. That's like a big question.
This is so difficult because one thing is how, let's say, power, and here is very blunt, but it's kind of going everywhere. Social media is part of this. You know, we consume whatever we want to consume, and somehow our readings are targeted to our interests. And this has been studied and talked, but of course the powerful will say, no, the media is switching these or changing these, and that's one rhetoric and one line that it's there, and sometimes it's true. And yeah, I mean, if we watch Fox, we'd say yes. People who watch Fox have their own reality, and it's pretty different from the reality we live in, right? So it's part true, but the issue is how you use that rhetoric to your advantage, and blame always the people who are criticizing you. Then you have the establishment. You have the New York Times here, right? The CNN news. But then you have a lot of things that have been going on with the press, which is the independent voices. And you have Politico, and you have, Huffington Post was the beginning of it. And in Latin America, this is very strong. I mean, if you really want to know something, you go to these alternative news sites.
Yeah, like Animal Político.
Animal Político, you go to La Silla Vacía in Colombia. I mean, you go to, Rio 12, if you want to know the Sinaloa. There has been, and social media has helped them a lot. And you have El Faro for Central American, it's based in El Salvador, and you have Plan B in Ecuador. You have... Then you have Efecto Cucuyo in Venezuela. I mean, you go country by country, and you have a bunch of journalists doing alternative. It's not alternative, independent news. More engaged with that. And it's true. We can choose what we want to hear, read, and see.
Right.
We don't watch Fox.
Yeah.
Because we don't. So there's a there's some sort of truth in the sense that they can be manipulated. There is another thing, which is another completely different thing, which is how did we make of violence a spectacle, how we commodify violence. And that is something that the press is to blame. In general, I'm not, but also it's all, again, a thin line. We need to know about these things. And there are centers creating more awareness among journalists of how to approach a victim of a natural disaster right after the person lost whatever. You cannot go and say, oh, what do you think? The question you just asked. Journalists need to be trained. It doesn't come, not everybody is empathic, not in the same way. Not everybody feels the same way towards the pain of the other person. And if that thing is not there, you have to train these professionals to be aware of that.
Can you name some examples of those?
The Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. They are. Now, I should name Periodistas de a Pie in Mexico, that Marcela Turati was one of the founders, and Daniela Pastrana, now that Marcela is no longer there. But they, for example, in the years of Calderón's presidential term, they realized what I was saying before, that they were reporters doing the social beat, as they say it. The social beat is poverty, health, education, usually in poor communities. And they cover that. Now, I'm going to open another window here. Usually, the journalists who cover these in the main media outlets are women. You know, you have the stereotypes. Let's go to the stereotypes. You have a guy in sports. You might have a girl in politics, but it's usually also a male-dominated. And there is a social class, let's say, in the field. If you do politics, imagine yourself coming to the newsroom. You have to hang out with politicians. You have to dress like that. If you're doing the social beat, if you go to the slum, you don't wear a tie. You have to be... So even physically, we are noticing how journalists also within their field occupy these specific places. I think that this is important, because when I talked to Marcela, she said, well, one day we realized that we were war reporters. We were going to the slums, we were going to these colonias, we were going to these poor communities, and we were not covering health, we were covering violence. And we weren't trained, as I said before, to walk through these dangerous territories and to handle the weight of the things that we saw, we heard, and we witnessed.
Right.
So she and this group of mainly female journalists, and again, not because anything else, but because the usual trend is that the social beat is on women reporters, realized that they needed some help. And they began to contact people from all the spectrum, from economists, psychologists, social workers, you name it. And they didn't have money to pay them. So what they would do is, some based in Mexico and some others, like, they will be catching, oh, this such and such is coming to give a talk at the university here at the UNAM. Let's call him and invite him or her to lunch and just tell her, we don't have money. We are starting this group. We realize that we are journalists that need to be better prepared for the job we're doing. And we don't even understand the whole picture, because our job has been to report on these So they created this network, which also became a network to protect themselves. Mm-hmm. So if you were reporting in Veracruz, which is one of the most deadliest states for journalists, and you receive a threat, you spread the word with them, and they will publish on social media, blah, blah, blah. So what they did at Periodistas de a Pie was amazing, because they were, I would say that the pioneers they are not a news site only. They are more than that. They are training journalists. Now they receive funding, they become, more visible, and they do an amazing job, because journalists can rely on that. And they receive, as I said, training. Now they are able to pay people to have workshops, to invite psychologists and say, we are also victims of a PTSD.
Right. It's time to refill our cups. Join us at the table for a nice chat and a cup of tea in a part of the episode we call the sobremesa. For this sobremesa, we wanted to invite all of our listeners to consider going onto social media platforms and podcast streaming platforms and go ahead and subscribe and write us some reviews, because that is how we can help spread the word about this podcast, the work that we're doing, and make sure that more people have access to listening to our wonderful, lovely guests.
For those of you who don't know, I have a really hard time self-promoting. Because I have no idea why. I always just feel like a smarmy version of myself. Like I should be like walking around with cards and being like, hey, read my book. Yeah. And it's like, that's just how things work now.
Yeah.
But I have such a hard time with it. And I was noticing this the other day. I was doing an interview and they asked me to write a bio about myself. And I was like, I'm a human person who does not like to be confused for a robot on the internet. And so
that's about it.
I don't know. Yeah, it's something I'm working on, but I guess I would really appreciate people to say nice things about our podcast and to follow us. And I do sort of want to talk to people.
Yeah, sometimes.
And
I think I have more comfort with it. Yeah. And also, just as we mentioned, I can talk all day anyway. Mm-hmm. But I think it's worth thinking about how hard it is sometimes to talk about ourselves, especially if we have some doubts about doing that or doubts about ourselves. And self-promotion can feel, or maybe has been taught to us as like you're bragging or you're seeking attention or things like that. And I think at the end of the day, that's something that is really internalized and is really valid. And also a big part of this podcast is to connect. So for people to interact with us and to help us spread, what we really believe in, which is the message that we have on this podcast around accessibility and visibility, it's going to require us to be a little bit loud and proud sometimes. And I think that is valid, and we can just be honest about how hard that can be sometimes. And, when you go for a job interview
I'm not good at interviews. It's so hard.
Right. Because they just want you to talk about yourself the whole time. And that's hard for a lot of people. You're not alone in that.
It's like I did something once.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I've
I
helped
like
people,
jobs.
Yeah, I've helped people
money.
with their resumes, and I'll be like, you forgot this whole huge, amazing thing you did. And they're like, oh, right. Yeah. And so, just hard to also acknowledge that, and that's a shared thing with a lot of people, especially if you've faced any struggle in life or been told that you're not valuable or you're not worth it for whatever reason or whatever part of your identity, to say that you are, and that we're going to model doing that here.
Yeah. And I guess we don't do it with every episode. I mean, it would be fine if we did, but I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I noticed that, it's something that a lot of people just kind of put in and we don't. And I don't know. I kind of like that about ours. I don't think it's wrong to put it in, but I sort of like the way we do things here. It's a little bit more low key.
Yeah, and it kind of connects to the midpoint of the season episode that we did around taking our time with the podcast and around not putting more pressure than we need to on it. So we're not here to make a ton of money. We're not here to self-promote all the time. But we do care about this conversation spreading. We do care about the importance of prioritizing mental health within Latinx communities, prioritizing bilingual access to bilingual services, about prioritizing connection for people of color that in general, and also that are mental health professionals and might not feel heard or seen in their agencies. And so to spread that message, we're doing a podcast. And so to spread the podcast,
you got to self-promote a little.
We got to self-promote a little bit. So if you would just go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, write us a review, tell us what you think, and share on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever is your favorite platform.
Yeah, and we all joking aside, I do actually want to interact with people, and it's something I've been looking forward to. But also know, and you will notice this if you go into our Facebook, that we do not always we do not have the 1 hour response time. It may take a little bit of time, but know that that's because of our own boundaries, and that if we take a little bit of time, you'll get a better response from us and perhaps a deeper conversation. So, yeah,
feel free to reach out whenever. And now back to the interview.
So I kind of want to take it back to Javier Valdez because you mentioned him briefly, but I don't think all of our listeners know who he is. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about him and what happened.
I wasn't a very close friend to Javier. I was a friend through work. And I have said this before, because the work they do and the work I do.
Javier was with Rio 12.
Yes. Yeah. You know very intimately these people because you're touching to you talk to these people about these things. So it's not that it's a friend that you chat all the time, but it's somebody you know very well just because of the job you do. You're linked to these through this very intimate. And I met him in 2007 when I went the first time to Culiacán, and
Which is in the state of Sinaloa.
Yes, I'm sorry. And Culiacán I chose because I wrote a book about the representation of narco-trafficking, and I wanted to know how the people living in the bedrock, let's say, of the whole narcotics trade, illegal narcotics trade began. And that's Culiacán in Mexico and Medellin in Colombia. And then I interview writers, journalists, artists, lawyers. So that's how I met Javier. And he told me that 5 years ago, he and his friends, former reporters from La Jornada, blah, 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 or El Norte, founded this independent weekly. It came out weekly, called Rio 12. And actually it ended up winning one of the most prestigious journalist prizes, the Maria Moore Cabot Prize in 2011. And Javier was part of that. And they did a great job, and he was very enthusiastic with that. He didn't publish yet any book. In that, he was the reporter, but he also had a column called Mala Hierba, wheat, which is wheat in Spanish. And it has this, it's a game, because wheat grows everywhere, but wheat is also weed, cannabis. So it has this, it's a playful word, and in 1,000 words he will give snapshots of violence, but we're more related to the culture of the daily life, how people live in threat. And it wasn't the story of a shooting, it was the story of how people were afraid to go and have ice cream in the park.
Right.
And with a very, very keen, very witty way of writing. And he was waiting for publishing houses in Distrito Federal in Mexico City to pay attention to his writings. 2 years, he told me that time, 2 years my books have been there, nobody paid attention to them. So the violence escalated with Calderon, And immediately Javier became a very visible voice. And in a span of 6 years or so, he was the guy who knew the most about these things, and he published several books, all of the Malayervas in his books. But through time, the Malayervas became more complex, longer, giving account of not just the snapshot, but as they became longer in the books, they give more detail on who was the character, more profiles of the people involved, and also of what it meant for him to write about these things, which was the most important thing. His last book is called Narcoperiodismo. And Javier really gave a new voice and put a lot of things in words that were shocking for the rest of the country, I would say. So he was awarded. He became a correspondent for a French kind of Associated Press. He was a correspondent with La Jornada. And he was a voice very important to understand. And he continued to be a reporter, meaning that he went to the ground, told stories about who was there, when, why, and then on the side, these more literary stories, I would say, about the culture and how it permeates every relationship. In 2009, when I saw him again, his books were about to be published, and Rio Doce had a threat because people put a bomb in their office in the middle of the night. Nobody was injured, but it was a clear message, and he was panicking. So imagine him from, let's say, 2008, 2009. He was killed last year. He lived under fear all those years. And he wrote all these books under a severe stress, as all the reporters in Rio Doce. At the same time, Javier was so visible. Everybody knew him in Mexico and abroad, that there was some sort of unspoken belief that nobody will do anything to him. And this is...
Yeah, I mean, that's what I thought. It was such a shock when he was murdered, because you don't think that the big guys are going to get murdered.
So we we have to understand that Mexico is a very centralized country. So people or journalists who work in the States are more vulnerable, usually because they work in small media outlets that they don't have the infrastructure to protect them. So Veracruz, Guerrero, even Tamaulipas. But the Rio Doce, even though it's Sinaloa, they were pretty visible. And Javier, on his own, his name was known. And we have the story of Ruben Espinosa, who left Guerrero or Veracruz, and went to the Mexico City looking for that shelter. Mexico City was the peaceful place, and he was killed there. And it was also a shocking murder, because it was the first time that a reporter was killed in a middle-class neighborhood in Mexico City. So all the unspoken limits of how violence reached journalists have been trespassed. And so Javier received some threats and was dealing, if you read all what has been written about his death, it was imminent that he needed to leave Sinaloa, and probably because of many factors. Among them, his employers in La Jornada should have said, you have to come here or leave the country in a more effective way. He left his offices and was shot at noon in the middle of the street. And that was I mean, any assassination like this is shocking, but this is a very well-known reporter globally, not just in Mexico. So that limit of being known was also broken.
And to me, what was striking was the way it was reported as well. There was photographs, and I really struggled with that, with I guess that idea of it being a spectacle and somebody you know and their bodies like photographed in the street.
It is, that is a fine line too, because for journalists, and I understand this, he was such a well-known that if you don't show a picture, you don't really tell the message that how bad it is. And this needed to be known as how bad it is. That body was there at noon. It wasn't that he was on his own. It was a full... So I understand, and for me it was super shocking. But I understand that there has to be that element. And this is a discussion, academics know, this is a discussion that Virginia Woolf began with the 3 Guineas when she was talking about the pictures of the First World War, and this is Susan Sontag talking about how photographs report wars, and so this is an ongoing discussion. And I think that it has to be there. We cannot just say, oh, somebody else said this already. No, there are things that have to be said again and again and again because we cannot forget. But at the same time, and I agree with you, for me, knowing him, being in touch with him, it was devastating. But had I not seen that picture, probably the magnitude of this assassination would also... now I have that image, and it is important for me to keep that image as an image of atrocity. Because if I don't have that image, this atrocity kind of slips away. And again, I think that this is applied, in my opinion, to this particular picture or photograph, but this is something that needs to be talked about in everything, because yes, there are some pictures when we quote unquote consume violence that are there, and they are not necessarily adding anything to our knowledge of the events. So if you see, for example, a picture of a massacre, and you see awful bodies all ripped off, or you see just the wall full of bullet holes, the wall will be more striking. So there are ways in which we can convey a message through images that are more suggestive. And this leads to something else that we talk about, is the commodification of violence. I think that it's part of our system as well. Narco-trafficking, Latin America, this place where violence, I'm more talking here about literary terms. So we used to be the magical realism of the world, and that's how we were, let's say, consumed. And suddenly we are this place of narco-violence where these brutal things happen, and people are still so nice and festive and warm, and so there's one part of it, and we have to distinguish how journalism, among other discourses, play with this. Documentaries, novels, podcasts, how we show this without... We need consumers, but without making it only a stereotype, but trying to understand the phenomenon in its all complexity. And this is going back to the picture of Javier there. It was needed. The guy left his office. And the first thing that the authorities said, you know what they said? The first thing they said? He was driving a Corolla from 2000, I mean, an old Corolla for American standards, a 5-6 years old Corolla. Oh, the guys wanted to rob the car. I mean, it was even funny to think that he was going to be killed because guys wanted to take a Corolla. If you walk in Culiacan, you will be amazed because it's probably less than 1 million people living there. A province, capital. But the cars, I mean, you see these amazing, you see amazing, super expensive cars. And it doesn't match with the architecture of the city. So to think that this guy was living and the guys who killed him, it was a joke.
Yeah.
So, and what we talk about the journalists and we talk about their fears and their concerns, and think about the families. What they live, what the social fabric is, the friends, the colleagues. So this is part of it. They have to live with the silence of things that they know when they witness that their best friend, their colleague, their cuate is killed in the middle of the daylight, and nobody does anything to solve the crime. So that is just, how do you live with that? Even if you're not threatened, how do you live with that? When you know that, these are small cities, everybody knows each other. So if who might be behind these deaths.
Well, and earlier you mentioned disappearances as well. I think, with that comes a different level as well for family members, right?
Terrible.
Of this not knowing of, I think that also in terms of mental health impacts.
It is. I remember that I spoke with a journalist and he told me once that he couldn't keep writing about what he needed to be writing about because the family said, we could deal with your death, but we could not deal with your disappearance.
Yeah.
And that is, and that was the limit. There is another part that I think that it's very interesting because I have, I work with these and I am an academic, and so I go and present my work in these academic forums, and people react like this. Why do they do it?
Why do they report?
Yeah, if they know that it's so dangerous, why they just don't turn around? And I'm always puzzled by this question because I even heard a very young, promising scholar from Harvard saying they shouldn't do that. They should turn around and then they don't do it. And so I want to look at the complexities of this, and it has to do, on the one hand, to what I was saying later, that it's many of them began reporting on social issues that turn out to be war. And I think that that's the case for Central Americans, for Mexicans, perhaps Colombians have a different, because Colombia has this long, it's the longest war that a country has had in our hemisphere. So Colombians have a different history or background to this claim that I'm going to say, but they didn't choose. It happened that their job took them there.
Well, and it goes back to that question, like, how do you live with it?
Exactly. And then the other thing is like, how do you turn around?
Right.
How could you even possibly think that it's easy to turn around? And it has to do with agency again. One of the reasons they don't turn around, I think that it's linked to trauma. Because, and I'm not blaming, this is very tricky what I'm going to say, but one of the symptoms of your PTSD is anger. And anger that could go outside or inside. And so we have the typical case of a trauma, a PTSD, would be what the usual type of the the veteran of Vietnam who comes and it's in such a traumatic stage that he is violent with his wife or goes and kills. We have that story. And it's a product of his own trauma, not solved. But I think that in case of a journalist, that rage is expressed in their need to continue there, And sometimes it can play against them. It does. I mean,
it can really suck you in too.
Exactly.
It becomes this
it's
cycle.
Obsession. Yeah. It's your obsession. And I'm not blaming journalists for this. I'm saying what society is doing to them to have them leave these things. But to ask the question why they continue doing that, I think that it's a question about, that question should be asked and answered from what kind of societies do we want to live in. It's not a simple question. It's not a matter of this person's choice, because after this person there are many others. It is not a matter of a profession. It's a matter of the kind of societies we want to live in. And these people are facing the worst part of our societies, and we're blaming them? Mm-hmm. Give me a break. It's a lot more complex. Yeah. And I think that journalists, again, leave this lonely. They are not the ones who are at the center of the spot. At the center of it all are the people who have been massacred, the people who have been disappeared. So they don't dare to say, it happened to me, because whatever happens to them is not as big or as important as what happened to the other victims. There's this professor in UT who studies trauma among those who stand in the vicinity,
right,
to traumatic events.
Like secondary trauma.
Exactly. But I think that in the case of journalists, we cannot talk about secondary trauma. Mm-hmm. They are secondary, but at the same time, they are target because they see their colleagues being killed for the job they do.
Absolutely. And thinking through isolation, not just in terms of how you're feeling, but possibly also physically, from not feeling safe to walk outside, or the ways that someone might become physically isolated as well in that kind of situation, and knowing that isolation is also a huge risk factor. Yeah. And so just thinking through all the different ways in which all those risk factors can accumulate and create a lot of challenges. And if you have someone who isn't being seen as the primary victim, then how many people are reaching out and providing support and offering services? And so it's great to hear about, I think, the network of people doing that. And at the same time, I feel like I would imagine that there's still a lack of support in a lot of different ways.
That's why the work of the Periodistas de a Pie is amazing, because they realized that they needed a network created.
And they're out of Mexico City?
Mexico City. And they have a website, and they have news. But most of the news they put in their site are related to how journalists are also there. But there's another side of this that has to do with journalism as a field. And the fact that Javier Valdez and his friends created Rio Doce. This is now 15 years ago or 20 years ago. It's amazing. But it also gives you a hint that working for the main big journalists, media outlets, it's no longer a way of being effective, of doing effective journalism. So it's amazing that you have these groups of journalists doing alternative journalism or independent journalism. So I really think that when we talk about this, what comes obvious, it is there, but when you can actually articulate how is it that big corporations and money works with our power, with people in power, that is the limits of our democracies.
I have one more question, and that was, can you talk just, and you don't have to go into detail, but just like a little bit about how this has impacted you emotionally, how this research and writing?
I'm finishing my book now, and usually you end your book with the first page, which is acknowledgments. Mm-hmm. you finish the manuscript and you go back to write that first page. And I just said that it has been humbling. I have met amazing people and people that have taught me so many different things, and they are giving their lives consciously or unconsciously for the things that they are reporting. And it has been a humbling process. I just feel that I hope whatever I write makes justice to the things that I'm trying to write. It seems like a game of words, but I hope I can contribute in some way to their own understanding of their work. They don't have the time to stop and ponder and say, wow. So I hope my book contributes to that. And for I just feel extremely grateful that I could do this, and so fortunate.
Oh, thank you.
So what is your favorite tea, if you have one, and why?
So I answered, I don't know. I like teas. And I was telling Ali that herbal teas in Ecuador, at least for some generations, I don't know, they are called agua de vieja, will be translated literally like water of old ladies.
Old lady water.
Old lady water.
Yeah.
But it's the thing that our abuelitas drank. Mm-hmm. And I love them all. I don't know why.
You love all the abuelitas.
Yes, I love all the abuelitas.
All the viejitas.
I do.
We do too. I think we feel like we're abuelitas at heart.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for coming.
Gracias.
It's lovely having you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LatinxMHPod, find us on Facebook and YouTube, and subscribe everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hasta la próxima!